Beijing, January 1255. The snow had been falling for 3 days. Inside the imperial palace of Mungke Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, 2 men were being escorted toward each other down a corridor of fire-lit stone. Neither had asked to be here. Neither had a choice. One was a Taoist monk named Li Zhichang, 70 years old, weathered, a man who had spent decades in mountain silence, studying the void between words. The other was a Buddhist abbot named Namo, younger, sharp-eyed, the preferred spiritual advisor of the Khan's own mother. They were not meeting for tea. The Khan had issued a decree. The Taoists and Buddhists of his empire had been at war, not with swords, but with ink and accusation for years. Pamphlets, forged scriptures, stolen temples. The Taoists had published a text claiming Buddha himself was a student of Laozi. The Buddhists had responded with fury. Petitions had reached the Khan's throne from both sides, each demanding that the other be destroyed. Mungke Khan had grown tired of it. He made a decision that would be remembered for 700 years, not because it was wise, but because it was terrifying. He summoned both sides to debate, publicly, in front of his court, and he made one thing clear: the losers would face consequences, severe ones. This was not a philosophical conversation. This was a trial with no neutral outcome. To understand what happened in that hall, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1255. The Mongol Empire had consumed everything: China, Persia, the steppes of Russia. Kingdoms that had stood for 1,000 years had simply stopped existing. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory. They absorbed religions, philosophies, entire ways of thinking, and held them up against each other like a man comparing tools. Mungke Khan was, by the standards of his time and ours, genuinely curious about religion. He hosted Christian priests, Muslim scholars, Buddhist monks, Taoist sages. He asked questions. He listened. He was not a man of simple faith. He was a man of power who understood that ideas, like armies, needed to be evaluated for their usefulness. But power has a way of distorting everything it touches. When a man with armies asks you a question about the nature of the universe, it is no longer a philosophical question. It becomes something else entirely. The Taoists had, for decades, been the favored spiritual tradition of the Mongol court. The great Taoist master Qiu Chuji, known as Changchun, the eternal spring, had made a legendary journey to meet Genghis Khan himself in 1222, walking thousands of miles across deserts and mountains at the age of 73. Genghis had been moved. He had granted Qiu Chuji extraordinary privileges: exemption from taxes, protection of Taoist monasteries, authority over all religious institutions in northern China. For 30 years after that meeting, the Taoists had flourished under Mongol patronage, like a vine growing on a stone wall. Not because the wall loved the vine, but because the vine was useful. And then the vine got too comfortable. In the decades that followed Qiu Chuji's death, a faction within the Quanzhen Taoist order had begun making claims that crossed a line. They published texts, the Laozi Huahu Jing, the classic of Laozi's conversion of the barbarians, asserting that after Laozi rode his ox westward out of China, he had traveled to India, where he was reborn as the Buddha. Which meant in plain logic that Buddhism was simply a lesser foreign version of Taoism. It was a claim so provocative, so deliberately insulting, that it reads almost as a dare. The Buddhists did not ignore the dare. They brought their grievances to the court with meticulous documentation. And Mungke Khan, who had been patient long enough, gave his answer in the form of a command. Debate, here and now, before everyone, and understand what you are gambling. The debate of 1255 was not the first time these two traditions had faced each other in formal contest. There had been smaller debates, regional skirmishes of ideas throughout the Mongol period. But none of them had felt like this. This one had weight. The terms had been set in advance. 17 propositions. The Taoists would defend their claims, including the Huahu texts, against Buddhist challenge. Judges were appointed from within the Mongol court itself. 300 monks from each side were permitted to attend. The audience also included Confucian scholars, Christian missionaries, and the Khan's own advisors, all watching with the cool attention of men who know that whatever happens in this room will matter. Li Zhichang, the man who had been escorted down that stone corridor, had not wanted to be here. He was a scholar, a poet, a man of genuine learning within the Quanzhen tradition. He had studied under Qiu Chuji himself. He understood the Tao Te Ching not as a weapon, but as a map to something that could not be argued into existence. And yet here he stood, forced to argue. This is the first thing worth noticing. He had not chosen this battle. The battle had chosen him. The political machinery of empire had reached down, picked him up, and placed him on a stage he never wanted. His opponent, Namo, was different. Namo had been waiting for this. He had the precision of a man who had been building his case for years, compiling errors, cataloging forgeries, identifying exactly where the Taoist claims collapsed under historical scrutiny. He was not angry. He was prepared. And prepared in this context was a kind of weapon that anger cannot match. The debate began with the Huahu controversy, the claim that Laozi had become the Buddha. Namo's argument was methodical and devastating. He presented textual evidence. He showed contradictions in the Taoist texts. He demonstrated point by point that the Laozi Huahu Jing was not an ancient scripture, but a fabrication. A text that had been forged, edited, and republished over centuries to serve political purposes. Li Zhichang could not answer these charges, not adequately, because they were, in the deepest sense, correct. The Taoist delegation lost the debate, not narrowly, comprehensively. The judges ruled against them on proposition after proposition. When the final verdict was delivered, Mungke Khan issued his sentence. The Taoist texts in question, including the Huahu scriptures, were to be burned. 237 Taoist temples that had been seized from Buddhists were to be returned, and 17 Taoist monks, chosen as representatives of the losing side, were to have their heads shaved and be forced to convert to Buddhism as public punishment. Li Zhichang survived. But the world he had known, the world of Taoist privilege, of imperial favor, of the long shadow of Qiu Chuji's legendary journey, was over. The Mongols had held the debate. The Taoists had lost. The consequences were real. But here is what the history books almost never mention. Here is what gets buried under the politics, the dates, the lists of burned texts, and converted monks. In the years before the debate, as the conflict between Taoists and Buddhists was escalating, as pamphlets were being printed and accusations were flying, and both sides were racing to the Khan's court to be the first to demand justice, there was a different Taoist who said nothing. His name is not in most of the records. He appears only in fragments, in margin notes from monks who encountered him and found him baffling. He was an elder within the Quanzhen order, a contemporary of Li Zhichang, a man who had reportedly been offered a position of authority within the Taoist hierarchy and had declined. When the Huahu controversy began to build, when the more ambitious faction within the Quanzhen order was pushing to publish the provocative texts, to seize more temples, to press their political advantage while Mongol favor was still warm, this man apparently said 3 things that no one wanted to hear. The first, the texts are not honest. The second, the favor of an empire is not the same as the favor of heaven. The third, a sword that you draw too often will find its own use for you. He was ignored. The political momentum was too strong. The opportunities seemed too good. The Taoists were favored. They had access. They had leverage. Why not use it? Why not press the advantage? Why sit in the mountains and watch while others were shaping the world? This is the thing about the Tao that cannot be argued into a debate hall and cannot be written into a political pamphlet. The Tao Te Ching, almost from its first page, is suspicious of advantage. It describes a kind of knowing that does not accumulate power so much as it recognizes the moment when power has already begun to consume itself. He who stands on tiptoe does not stand firm. Laozi wrote that. And then, according to the legend, the one even the Taoists believed before they turned it into a political weapon, he climbed on an ox and left. He left China. He rode west into the unknown. He did not stay to consolidate his wisdom into an institution. He did not found a temple. He did not demand that kings acknowledge him. He left. That is the act that the entire Huahu controversy was, in its strange way, built around, and yet it is the act that the Taoists who fought that debate had completely forgotten how to perform. They had forgotten how to leave. They had learned instead how to grip. And here is the twist that changes everything you think you know about this story. The Taoist who lost the debate in 1255, Li Zhichang, did not emerge from the experience destroyed. He wrote about it. In the years that followed, Li Zhichang composed a text called the Changchun Zhenren Qiu, a record of his master Qiu Chuji's legendary western journey to meet Genghis Khan. It is one of the most important travel documents of the medieval period. Historians of the Mongol Empire have relied on it for centuries. It preserved not just the journey, but a portrait of a man who understood, genuinely understood, how to move through power without being swallowed by it. Li Zhichang had watched his tradition overreach. He had been forced to stand in a hall and defend claims he knew, in his scholar's heart, were indefensible. He had lost. Publicly, painfully. And then he did something the ambitious faction of his order had forgotten was possible. He turned inward. He wrote not a rebuttal, not a new political pamphlet, not a document designed to recover lost status. He wrote a record of a journey, of walking, of mountains crossed and rivers forded, and a very old man on a very long road going towards something he could not name and would not possess. The text survived. The burned Huahu scriptures did not. This is not a coincidence. This is the principle in operation, not as an idea, but as an outcome. The things that were grasped most tightly were the first to be taken. The thing that was simply allowed to be, a record of a journey, an act of witness and memory, moved through 7 centuries like water through stone. Not by force, by nature. You have felt this. Maybe not in a Mongol debate hall, with your head at stake and an empire watching. But you have felt the version of it that belongs to your life. The moment you overplayed your hand. The negotiation where you pushed one step too far. The relationship where the need to win the argument cost you the thing the argument was actually about. The career move made from fear of losing ground rather than love of what lay ahead. We live in a culture that treats advantage like a finite resource that must be seized before someone else takes it. Algorithms reward aggression. Platforms amplify whoever grabs attention hardest. The logic of the content economy. The logic of the content economy. The world where creators film videos, build audiences, and watch metrics move is, in its way, the same logic that drove the Quanzhen Taoists to forge those texts and push those claims. We have access. We have momentum. Use it. Now, before the window closes. But the window always closes. That is not pessimism. That is physics. The Taoists who burned the monasteries and published the forgeries and raced to the Khan's court. They had read the Tao Te Ching. They had memorized it. They could recite passages about the danger of force, the futility of grasping, the way that rivers don't cut through mountains by pushing harder. They knew all of it, and knowing it didn't save them. Because the Tao Te Ching is not a list of lessons. It is a description of something you can only learn by stopping. Li Zhichang stopped. After the loss, in the silence of having nothing left to defend, he stopped. And in that stopping, he found the only thing worth writing. Not a weapon, but a record. Not a claim, but a witness. 700 years later, scholars still read what he wrote. The texts he was forced to defend have been ash for 6 centuries. The real teaching of the 1255 debate was never said out loud in that hall. It wasn't in any of the 17 propositions. It wasn't in the Buddhist arguments, or the Taoist rebuttals, or the Khan's judgment. It was in what happened after. It was in the difference between the men who rebuilt the machine and the man who built the record. It was in the stubborn, quiet, unkillable truth that the things we hold gently outlast the things we clutch with both hands. The Tao does not win arguments. It simply remains long after the debaters have forgotten what they were fighting for.